Welcome, everybody. We're really happy that you're here today to talk about research. So this is our fourth town hall. So we're really excited again to have you all here today. And today we're going to talk about our funded and mentored research programs. So a little bit about our agenda today. Everybody did receive this in advance. We're going to talk a little bit about the OWCN research programs. And then we have two speakers who are going to speak about their specific research that they've been doing. And then again, we'll have that Q&A session at the end. So we've got a pretty jam-packed schedule. So I think we're just going to go ahead and start right in. Our first two speakers are going to actually give you some background about the OWCN research programs. So first we have Dr. Michael Zaccardi, the Executive Director of the One Health Institute and also the Director of the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, who you all probably know really well. He's going to speak about our competitive grants program. And then after Dr. Zaccardi, Dr. Lorraine Barbosa, our Senior Manager of Care Operations, is going to speak about the Mentored Research Program. So I'm going to turn it over to Lorraine and Mike and let them take over.
Great, thank you. So as Deneen said, we're going to be talking briefly, Lorraine and I are going to be talking briefly about our research program just to kind of set the stage for Becky and Katja a little bit later. So just as background information, I think as everybody knows, OWCN does stand on its 4 R's: readiness, response, reaching out. But really kind of one of the key things that differentiates our program from other programs is a real core part of research. And research is one of the key reasons why the OWCN went from OSPR over to UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine, was the ability to integrate research into the overall programmatic emphases as part of OWCN. So we do have 4 key goals of the OWCN research program, and all the proposals that we fund look at these key goals to make sure they match. First and foremost, of course, is improving animal care. So trying to better refine protocols, procedures, understand treatments and diagnostics, and figuring out how to mitigate effects of oil on wildlife, how to prevent it from happening or the negative effects. We also want to be assessing wildlife health. And so these are medical conditions that may affect care, not necessarily oil related, but maybe secondary to oiled wildlife rehabilitation, compiling health parameters, determining health impacts of exposure, and then assessing the impacts of the treatments that we do use in these animals. We also want to be understanding population information that can both aid in preventing as well as caring for oil wildlife. So this may be understanding the demography and distribution of wildlife throughout California, but also understanding how populations respond to oil spills, not only the individual animals in our hand, but at a population level. And last but certainly not least, developing new technologies. So our research program is actually the Research and Technology Development Program of the OWCN. So what we want to be doing is really pushing the envelope to better understand how we can address these things. So methods to detect and quantify oil exposure, radiotelemetry devices, developing hardware, etc. So really, again, pushing the envelope as we can. With our proposal requests for our competitive grants programs, we do have 2 types of proposals that we fund. We have full proposals, so that's anything greater than $15,000 a year. It is a full proposal process that we start with a pre-proposal. Pre-proposals go in. If pre-proposals are accepted, we then request a full proposal, and then those are reviewed. We also have a small grant proposal program. Previously was $10,000. Now it's up to $15,000. And really that's a 2-page proposal, really designed to be either a lower cost or a pilot study to do a 1-year project to better understand some of those things and the goals. Our general schedule, we did shift several years ago to be a July 1 to June 30 funding cycle, which matches our fiscal. But usually our request for proposal goes out in July. Pre-proposals are due in September. They're reviewed by our scientific advisory committee. October full proposals are requested. And then in December is when both the small grant and the full grant proposals are due. And then we let people know by April. So the review process, just to peek behind the curtain a little bit, we do have a scientific advisory committee made up of 12 strong scientists. What they do is they review the pre-proposals, they numerically score them. They don't give extensive comments, but we base a cutoff for which full proposals we request based on that numeric score. From there, we actually do meet again in March, where we review the full proposals as well as all the small grant proposals. Each proposal is assigned a primary reviewer, 2 secondary reviewers from the Scientific Advisory Committee, and then an external reviewer. Get together, discuss the findings, discuss the pros and the cons, especially as they relate to relevance to the goals, scientific merit and quality, and the ability of the investigators to perform the work. We actually rank them based on high, medium, and low priority, set a cutoff, and then those proposals that are recommended by the Scientific Advisory Committee goes to our advisory board for approval for our advisory meeting that is either in March or April. Those recommendations then go forward and the investigators are notified. So one of the things, and I just pulled these data yesterday, we've had tremendous success in this program. We've almost funded 200 projects since 1996 and actually allocated more than $4.5 million specifically related to better understanding the effects of oil on wildlife. We do need to update this information, but we have more than 83 in peer-reviewed literature publications going out. We need to get it for the last 5 years. And we have done 4 post-release projects that have been more internally focused. So tremendous success of this program, and it's something that the OWCN is truly proud of. From there, I'm going to hand it over to Lorraine to talk about a second part of the OWCN research program.
All right, so I'm going to tell you all a bit about the mentored research program. And for anyone who hasn't heard me already give my spiel, what is the mentored research program? Well, it is, let me get that button there. Okay, so it's designed to promote member organizations to identify new and better ways of caring for oiled animals. So we know that rehab organizations do a tremendous job caring for hundreds, thousands of animals every year. So I suspect while juggling the time and resources needed to care for your patients, some of you have figured out new, novel ways to provide and improve that care. So taking these ideas and practices and developing research projects, however, can be intimidating or just, challenging if you haven't had that experience before. So that's exactly what this program is for. It's meant to assist with taking those ideas and developing actual research projects with them so that we can share these awesome ideas with the rest of the network and to help improve animal care all around. So it's exclusively for OWCN member organizations. And what we do is it allows our members to work with somebody from the OWCN management team in order to develop and conduct a research project while providing funding and support to conduct that project, as well as writing up and presenting and even publishing the results if indicated. So a little bit different in terms of success from the competitive grants program. We actually have had 3 projects funded so far. And I'm really hoping to develop this program a bit further. So just to tell you a little bit about those 3 projects, we had 2 by Julie Skoglund from International Bird Rescue, one regarding keel cushions on the effects of behavior in Western grebes, and then also another one on characterization of dermal lesions, which Dr. Doerr is going to present to us shortly. And then another project by Dr. Doerr looking at rehabilitated seabirds and waterfowl in terms of their longevity and dispersion. So those have been great. And we actually I wanted to give a quick shout out to Megan Ware from Marine Mammal Care Center, LA, who is our most recently accepted mentor research applicant. And she will be conducting a project called Proportional Anatomy, Metrics Matter. So she's gonna be looking at orogastric and endotracheal tube size determination in pinnipeds. So looking at external factors, characteristics that we can better gauge what the appropriate size of these tubes are to use in them. So that's awesome. And then I'm going to put out my plug to you all, and why should you participate? Well, It supports ideas coming directly from you all who are working directly with the animals, and we know that you have great ideas. It's your chance to improve knowledge for animal care, not only for your own organization, but for the entire network. Research projects are thought-provoking and they look great on your resume, and you can get funding and support to carry out your project. So it's a super good deal. I want to tell you a little bit about the process just for anyone who hasn't heard from me already. So it's hopefully we tried to pare it down so it'd be a pretty simple application process because we really want to get you all involved. Basically, you turn in this form here, which is a project concept form. It's got 6 questions. 3 of those have to do with your contact information, and 3 are about the idea you have for improving animal care. And basically what happens is you submit this form. A few of us on the management team review the form, make sure that it looks like a viable idea and something that we also agree would improve care for oiled wildlife in some way. And then we pair you from that point with a mentor from the management team. And as mentors, we help you develop a full project proposal. So we help you elaborate on the project design and everything to do with being able to carry out that project into a proposal. And then you resubmit that proposal to us. A lot of times, since we helped you develop that proposal, you have a really good chance of getting funded. So that's the really good news. Once you get funded, we continue to work with you all the way through carrying out the project, analyzing the data, writing up a final report, hopefully writing up a paper for publication. So basically support all the way through the process. So it's a super cool program. You can check out the website. There's more information there. And there's even a link to a project concept form example, a full project proposal, a final report, and a poster presentation. Thank you very much, Julie, for allowing us to use your project as the example. So you can look there for that. And I will be eagerly awaiting all of your applications. Definitely reach out to me if you have any questions. I think this is a really awesome program, and I hope that you all will consider applying. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike and Lorraine. Okay, so let's move right into hearing about 2 of these projects. First, we have Dr. Rebecca Dorr. She is the Director of Research and Veterinary Science from International Bird Rescue. And she's going to talk to us today about the prevalence, incidence, and characterization of dermal lesions in diving birds undergoing rehabilitation. So Becky, I'm going to let you take it away, and thank you again for being here.
Okay, and I'm going to try to not go long. Trying to summarize a really complicated project in a very short amount of time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about skin lesions in diving birds. And Julie was definitely the lead on this. She made it happen. And Tara Kelly, really wanted to give a good thanks to her because she did all the statistics on this. All right, let's see if I can make this work. There we go. Okay, so what's the deal with keels, hawks, and toes in diving birds? So those of you who work with those species are probably familiar with their problems. So some of you are probably not. They have the issue that the tissue at their bony prominences is at risk of developing problems when they are not in the water. So it's prone to physical trauma. It can be burned by oil, etc. They also can simply have problems with perfusion when they are emaciated and exhausted, and run into problems with poor blood flow to all the areas that have pressure. So treatment of these problems is very complicated and time consuming, and sometimes it is or is not feasible. Historically, protective wraps have been used to ameliorate this problem, hopefully to prevent it, etc. Keel cushions, to the best of anyone's recollections that I have talked to, came into vogue in the mid-90s. Largely with loons were the first candidates. And then booties came along a little later, well, they were also started in the 90s, but they were made out of vet wrap. Vet wrap fell out of favor because it tends to make them crush their toes together, and it's not very comfortable and can be not the best material. And cotton booties came along relatively recently in the mid 2000s, around 2008. We switched to using cotton booties, and those have kind of lingered until today. There are some downsides to protective wraps. They take time to apply, they take time to take off. They can be wasteful of materials, especially if they are some of the ones that use vet wrap as a disposable product. They also have the potential to cause harm. If the wrap slips, it can cause various problems like being dead in the morning. Can be a big problem. Booty application can also cause a problem in that it can cause foot edema. So I was talking to Kurt Klumpner at one of the Effects of Oil on conferences at some reception. It's like, hey, is there any actual proof that any of these things do anything? And he's like, nope. So we started to plan doing a project on that to try to see if we could find some information on what really works and what doesn't and all that. So nonetheless, lacking anything except subjective information, this protective wraps have been the standard of care for quite a while now. Okay, so our hypotheses for this study were that a substantial proportion of birds enter care with these lesions existing already. Often hear and read it written that these lesions are captivity caused, which in my experience certainly is not the case. A lot of times they do have tended to come in the door with them already, but a lot of times they're not noticed. Another hypothesis, new lesions that develop during care will be less severe than those that are in birds that had them when they came in the door. That there might be an effect of the length of time it takes for the bird to become waterproof. That could certainly affect lesion development. And we kind of expect that lesions in oiled birds will be more numerous and severe than in non-oiled birds. There's also the added effects of burns, that sort of thing on those tissues. So another thing we really wanted to gain in this study is to figure out whether or not there was a maximum severity of a combination of lesions where it really ought to drive our euthanasia criteria. Because a lot of times we don't know, like, is that too bad and there's no chance this bird's going to get released, or how does that work? So we are attempting to answer some of those questions here. All right, so for our study, we enrolled all new western grebes, eared grebes, surf scoters, and common murres for our target species, both oiled and non-oiled. We had intended to exclude severe medical issues or critical patients. So if an animal came in the door, we were immediately going to euthanize it. We generally, it was excluded from the study. Animals were cared for by ordinary procedures, except for the fact that none of them got protective wraps. So each area of the body that we were interested in, namely toes, hocks, and keels, were evaluated with by three factors. We were looking at the nature of the skin wound, the skin character. You might notice over the joints on this bird on the right that the joints have some dark tissue over them. The second characteristic was swelling, and then the dimensions, how large it is. So the intent was to score these things when the bird came in the door and then twice a week thereafter. And we would continue scoring until the individual was waterproof for at least 3 days. So we weren't hauling them out of the pool regularly just to look at their lesions. And we also discontinued the study on birds that definitely required medical treatment. We didn't want to deny animals care because of the study. We also continued monitoring animals later in care as they were undergoing ordinary exams. So we do have data after those 3 days of waterproof for many birds. We created composite scores of overall lesion burdens, and we're comparing those against various characteristics statistically. And followed up on all those birds for all their outcomes and medical data. And we really tried to interfere with their rehabilitation as little as possible. Okay. So here's the complicated way that this gets started. So each toe joint was evaluated independently twice a week during the study based on these characteristics, each hock lesion, each wound. So even if an animal was totally normal, they got each one of these body parts looked at regularly. We used a digital caliper to measure things, and it ended up being quite complicated because there are 23 body parts of interest per bird. So if an animal did not have very many lesions, the evaluation was pretty quick, about 5 minutes. But if the animal had a lot of lesions, it could take up to 20 minutes per bird. So it's a lot of time being on the table, having your toes measured. So it's a fairly time-consuming process. Here's our data sheet. So we had lots of abbreviations for all of this. So I'll show you a diagram later, but so LD1, so that would be left digit number 1. And then we had a way that would be like a shorthand for writing out, okay, swelling score, skin score, et cetera, in a row separated by columns. And then this all got spreadsheeted. Okay, so I'm going to run through a bunch of results. All right, so the study enrollment ran the first winter. We get these animals generally as migrants, so we usually only see them mostly in the winter, biggest numbers of them in the winter. So during the first winter, we didn't really get enough animals, so we got an extension and enrolled birds the following year as well. So here's a breakout of what we were able to enroll. So you might see that Western grebes are definitely the one that the species that was most prevalent, both oiled and non-oiled. However, this was occurring at our Los Angeles center. We don't get very many murres, so there are actually only 2 murres enrolled in the study, and they were both oiled. Overall, we were able to enroll 131 birds in the study, including 74 oiled, 57 non-oiled, but yeah, about 70% were Western grebes. And for those 131 birds, we were able to complete 371 evaluations of their various body parts. So what did we find? We found that overall, with the comprehensive lesion burden scores that we developed, that we did not find a statistical relationship between how many lesions they had and their final disposition. So that was a little disappointing for me. I really wanted euthanasia criteria, but oh well. And however, the lesion burdens definitely were different by species. Oops. The Western grebes statistically had more lesions at admission than other species did. We also did not find any relationship between lesion burden and their oiling status. The non-oiled animals also have pretty much the same problems. I guess that's not unexpected from everybody who works with those animals. One interesting thing that I decided to plot out just for clinical interest is that when we had birds that had more than 4 of those biweekly scores calculated for each bird, I plotted them all and was trying to get a feel for when do these lesions actually get bad. So it seems like the animals come in the door and the lesions don't look like that much. They're just like a little flat patch of dead skin or something like that. And then as time passes, they like get rehydrated. The animal gets better perfusion maybe in those tissues, body starts to notice that there's a problem there, and they'll start to swell. So really the lesion scores would peak somewhere in that 10 to 20 days of captivity range. So anyway, the lesions definitely have a process they go through as they come in, progress, and then start to heal. So oiled birds took 4 to 11 days longer to become waterproof than non-oiled birds. I suppose that's not surprising since they certainly get stabilized and then washed, et cetera. And so that I would expect that could be a factor in them getting worse lesions. However, it really didn't seem to be the case that the time had any relationship to whether or not the severity of their injuries increased. So the oiled birds definitely took longer to become waterproof. And if we parse that out by species, it was also the case. So for Western grebes and eared grebes, the species we didn't really have very large numbers of. So a lot of times we couldn't break those out by species. For non-oiled birds, we did find that birds that spent more than 3 days in captivity at another center prior to coming to us did have higher maximum lesion severity scores than birds that came in quicker to us. Okay, here's some things that you guys might be really interested in. So So what happens when an animal doesn't have any lesions when they come in the door? Do they get them in captivity? All right, so we had 28 birds with 0 lesions when they came in. 36% of them developed lesions while they were in care, 64% did not. However, the new later lesions were significantly less severe birds that already had lesions at admission. So that supported our hypothesis that the animals that already had lesions when they came in the door are worse off. Another interesting circumstance that arose out of this is some birds were admitted on the same day that they were rescued. So straight off the beach birds, we had 29 of those. Only 5 of them had no lesions. The rest had at least 1 lesion. The average bird had 4 to 5 lesion toe joints, plus 1 or both hocks lesioned, and a smaller percentage of them had keel lesions. However, there were 5 that were not evaluated due to tar patties over their keel, and 3 out of 5 of those later were found to have keel lesions when they were washed, and 2 died before wash, and we weren't able to figure out whether or not they had keel lesions. Okay, keels overall. The keel lesions, there was a rather large number of birds that did end up having a keel lesion during care. However, they, in many cases, I think it was because we didn't notice or we were able to pick up lesions that were really mild. There were a lot of birds that had tar patties obscuring their keels. And those birds generally were found to have keel lesions later. I'm gonna have to whip through because man, I am gonna be too long here. So I'm gonna have to skip a bunch of stuff, sorry. We ultimately needed to have a milder keel category. We were able to see some that were really, really mild, that by the next evaluation, they would turn out to have a real serious keel lesion. Some of the keel lesions in the oiled birds did look like more like burns. Okay, so here's kind of a spread out of what birds came in the door with each toe lesion has a little spot there for western grebes, eared grebes, surf scoters. As you can see, there's a tremendous number of these toes that have problems when they come in the door. This is kind of what they look like after they've been in care for a little bit. There was no relationship to oiling on toe lesions. The non-oiled birds have just as many toe lesions. But again, they were worse for the birds that had them when they came in the door. We were able to treat quite a few of these. This is the same bird. 2 months later, it does take quite a while to treat these things. There were 38 birds that had no toe lesions at admission, and 24 of those never got any toe lesions, half oiled, half not oiled. Okay, so pathology. Birds that died or euthanized and died in a time frame where we could collect their histology fresh, got their legs and keels collected. We had a little cupboard full of feet for a while there. The red marks are where we had the tissues trimmed in for slides. Doing longitudinal slides on toes was kind of difficult for the pathology lab, but we managed to get that done anyway, with tremendous help from Amber Villarreal from UC Davis Pathology Lab. So generally what was found was variable ulceration with fibrinocellular crusts, which is to say scabs. So there's ulcers where the skin is missing and the body forms a scab. There was also a tremendous amount of tendon and tendon sheath and ligament inflammation and damage. As I had some long talks with Melissa Miller about this, and it does indeed appear that the tendons, when their tendon sheath has been removed, the tendon is toast. It's kind of like a joint. So the tendon sheath is producing lubricating fluid and providing nutrients to the tendon. So when the tendon sheath is ruined, that tendon is going to get screwed up. So sometimes grebes come in with tendons literally falling out of their feet. So those tendons are toast. Dermatitis on all of these skin surfaces was commonly found on histology to have colonies of cocci, and occasionally Melissa spotted some fungi and other things in there that were a little peculiar. There was one grebe that had a little piece of shell embedded in a nail, or embedded in a joint. It was kind of odd. She also found several birds that had frayed toenails that appeared to have bacterial invasion into the tip of the toe. And another big thing was that there were a lot of adhesions between different tissue layers. And this is commonly what we see in captivity, where it will appear as though the skin is dead in spots, and that the dead tissue becomes adhered to the deeper tissues underneath. You can either adhere to tendon or adhere all the way down into the bone. And some of those end up being quite severe injuries. So one thing that became apparent is that, microscopically speaking, she was able to see a lot of damage that was not apparent grossly. So I would say that what we see with our eyes is an underrepresentation of what is going on underneath. And we also discovered grebes are a little strange in some of the healing mechanisms that she spotted, and just how they're put together. This is a cross section of a grebe hawk, where they have a variable turducken of tendons inside each other. There's tendon inside tendon inside tendon. It's quite complicated. And this is just a beautiful picture that I thought you might like to see. This is a tip of a digit number 2 on a Western grebe. And just check out how thin those tissues are. So the bright pink on the edge is keratin with the scales. And grebes are unusual in that the tissue on the what would be a weight-bearing side, the plantar side of the foot, is actually thinner with smaller scales than on the dorsal side, where it's got thicker, bigger scales. There were often little cracks between the scales with some inflammation in the areas. And here's one of those adhesions we were talking about. So this big pink thing here is a tendon, and that star is representing an adhesion. Another odd thing about grebes was that they were commonly forming granulomas inside the joints, and wherever there was trauma, the body was walling it off and pushing it into a little ball, which was probably destined to get extruded, which is kind of what we see when the weird nastiness comes out of their toe joints. It certainly has seemed to us in practice that grebes will extrude their entire toe joint on some of their toe joints and then just heal it up like it never happened. It's very peculiar, but Melissa spotted a bunch of stuff that made it seem like that's actually real. And here is one of the odd ways that they were healing. So this is a toe bone running diagonally across the picture, and the black arrows are marking where the bird is getting kind of an odd perpendicular periosteal. So the outer layer of the bone is growing these struts that kind of stick off perpendicular to the bone. Our speculation was that actually might be kind of an anchor for fibrocartilage that's filling in behind the extruded granuloma that formed at the joint. So like the body walls it off and then builds some struts and like builds a fake joint. We've noticed in the past that after these things heal, they end up, if you take an x-ray, you can see a little gap where the joint used to be. Anyway, very odd. So summary, substantial proportion of diving birds arrive into care with these lesions already present. Birds without lesions at admission may really not need protective wraps because a big chunk of them don't get any lesions. Oiled birds are 4.5 times more likely to have a keel lesion than a non-oiled bird. Beware tar patties, they might be hiding nasty things underneath. And birds with really heavy lesion burdens can be successfully treated if circumstances allow. However, whether what those circumstances are that would allow that for a large number of birds is kind of a debate. And then no severity was identified that can really guide euthanasia decisions. We do successfully treat really horribly injured ones all the time. So our next steps are submitting papers for publication. We want to use the lesion scoring system to evaluate some interventions and treatments and try to figure out whether or not keel cushions are actually doing anything, and also to figure out whether there are different types of foot coverings that we can use to ameliorate some of these problems. Julie's got a lot of ideas for different designs and materials for keel cushions, etc. Personally, I'm a big fan of Tegaderm on their feet. Tegaderm goes nicely inside cotton booties. Hydrocolloid's been used in some cases. Some of that is also wonderful stuff. I really want to do a lot more work with the histology slide set that we had made. It's kind of spectacular, and there's no published information on what the normal anatomy of these animals is. Frankly, I'd like to produce something about that. And whenever Melissa's time opens up, we will be digging deeper into these pathology slides. And there we go. Thanks to everybody at Bird Rescue and OWCN. Nancy Anderson helped us a bunch and had some really helpful conversations. And then OWCN, Bird Rescue, and NWRA provided funding for this project. There we go. Sorry, I went a little long.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dora. Excellent presentation. Don't forget to list your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them, I promise. But before we do that, we have one more speaker coming all the way to us from South Africa. Dr. Kata Ludinya is going to speak to us about the post-oiling rehabilitation outcomes and long-term survival in Southern African seabirds. And Dr. Ludinya is the research manager at the Southern African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds, or SANCCOB, as you may know it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Ludinya.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to quickly share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see that. Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this town hall. This is very exciting to be able to speak to all of you. So after all, COVID-19 does have its positives. So at least we can join each other's webinars from all across the world, which is great. And obviously a huge thank you for the OWCN for funding our project. We are currently in our second year and we are about to submit our final proposal for hopefully our third year, but I want to present to you what we've done so far. And the research is led by SANCCOB, but it's in collaboration with a large number of people from different locations. They have all worked extensively in South Africa, but they're currently spread around the world and kind of stuck and not being able to come back to us. So it's a lot of emails and stuff going back and forth. Yeah, I actually feel a bit weird speaking to you because I think a lot of the people in the audience have actually been at the treasure in South Africa and come down all the way to South Africa to assist cleaning all these birds. I have to admit, I had not even seen an African penguin the day that the treasure went down. I think I saw my first African penguin in 2002 because I'm originally from Germany and not from South Africa. So yeah, so this picture might look familiar to some of you. It still just blows my mind. So what happened was that the treasure went down between two of the major African penguin colonies just north of Cape Town, and almost 20,000 African penguins were oiled due to the treasure. So this is just one of the horrendous pictures of just the extent of the oiling that was happening in those days. And then the first birds were admitted to SANCCOB, to our facility in Tableview. That is a facility that we still have. Luckily, we have been upgrading, and I don't know if some of you have been down to our new hospital, but when I started 4 years ago, it did actually still look a little bit like the top picture. So after the treasure, the first birds were admitted to SANCCOB, and it became clear very quickly that it was beyond the scope that SANCCOB could deal with in terms of facility, of logistics, of everything. So that's when I think a lot of you came down and started to assist, and the satellite station in Salt River was set up, which was a huge hall where all these pens were set up, and that's where probably a lot of you were spending the next few weeks up to months defrosting fish, feeding birds, cleaning, swimming, filling out sheets, all these things. I all know this just from history books. So I actually love to hear stories from those days. Yeah, and this is then kind of the whole bunch of birds ready for release, all nice and clean. And then, yeah, luckily, most of them were successfully released back into the wild. So it was an amazing, amazing success story, the cleaning and release of all these birds. And in those days, almost all birds were marked with flipper bands, with these metal flipper bands that we've still since abandoned. We're currently now using subcutaneous transponders, but a lot of the data that we're looking at here is still thanks to the flipper bands that were used extensively. So obviously there was a lot of research that went on after the treasure, looking at the success of the rescue and rehabilitation, how the bird survived in the wild after being cleaned, differences in breeding success between birds that were oiled and not oiled, and also looking at if it was actually feasible to hand rear African penguin chicks, which was, I think, done the first time during the treasure, which is now a kind of day-to-day job that we do at SANCOB, and it's a very successful conservation measure. But a lot of these publications were rather recent after the treasure oil spill. So the data set was still rather limited. It was still rather limited, but it was still a huge number of birds that had been ringed. So this is the information that we had on the rings of birds. Was over 17,000 oiled birds that we had ringing data for, but we only had ringing data. So we basically had a ring number and we knew the bird was, or we thought we knew the bird was oiled, was it hand-reared chicks or a translocated bird. We had no idea, information on the release, so how long these birds were in rehab. We had no information on health data, any blood tests, pre-release bloods, anything that was not available. And then almost 15 or 16 years later, these new data suddenly kind of fell into our labs, which were the original data sheets that were collected in the pens, pre-release bloods on the left, and then the release information on the right. And this data had been lost in drawers and boxes or whatever, and luckily somebody found it, realized that it was important, and we got scanned copies of these hundreds and hundreds of sheets that we then by hand started to digitize. And as you can just see on this slide, it's not always easy to read handwriting from hundreds of different people 15 years later. So there was a lot of mystery work going into this. But what was very nice that we were able to double check, for example, age of birds that we thought we had ring data for, thinking they were adults, which it turned out they were actually juveniles. So there was a lot of mismatch between this new data set and the old data set that we had been, or that people in South Africa had been working with for years. So, and then we also, when kind of adding up the numbers, we realized that we were still birds short. So we had some of the original ring numbers that didn't appear in these files. From the numbers, we knew something was missing. So we actually discovered that the birds that were at SANCOB, as well as birds that when Salt River closed down, kind of towards the end of the rehab process, were returned to SANCOB to then be released. These data was actually still hidden in boxes in the roof at SANCOB, and that actually delayed our analysis, because we were about to start with all our analysis that we had promised when we realized that we were still bird short. So we figured, let's just rather find all data that we can. So this photo on the left is actually Nola Parsons sitting on the roof beams in SANCOB in our postmortem room, going through old boxes and double checking numbers that were mistakes, or that we tried to figure out the correctness of the data. So this is now the data set that we will now finally be able to start running our analysis. So there's still some things that need to be updated in terms of the age classes and things, but we now have release data of almost 15,000 birds. So now we know how long were these birds in rehab, where they were released, the actual age of these birds at release, and we have health data, so that is pre-release bloods of over 3,000 birds that we can now do the analysis of what we want to do. We also have had quite a lot of change we had over 1,000 birds that had been classified as hand-reared chicks, which turned out were actually juveniles, but then we had other birds that had been classified as adult that were actually chicks. So a lot of the previous published analysis actually need to be corrected, and we've started looking at some of those things. So this is what we set out to answer as part of our OWCN project. So we wanted to evaluate the individual parameters, like, for example, duration of rehabilitation, health parameters, how they affect the long-term survival and the reproductive success of oiled and rehabilitated birds. So the hypothesis was that birds with lower percentage of oiling, shorter duration, all these would actually have a better long-term survival and reproductive success. Unfortunately, we don't have any information on the percentage of oiling. That was just, I think, in the madness of the day, there was no way to record all that. So we're going to exclude that from our analysis. I don't know why I keep on losing my mouse. Okay. But we now have these 17,000 release data and 3,000 health data that we can now compare with all the reciting data that we have. So we have an amazing African penguin ringing and reciting database, which now in more recent years includes all our pit birds, with over 300,000 ring readings, of which 35,000 readings are from treasure birds of over 10,000 individuals. And we have breeding success data for about 800 birds that were involved in the treasure, with release data from the 2 colonies that these birds were from. And seeing that the treasure is now 20 years ago, we literally we have, I think, a handful of treasure birds still being alive, but basically we can now evaluate the effect of the oiling and the treatment on the entire post-oiling lifespan of these birds. And that is what we are now trying to do. So we'll look at the long-term survival and the breeding success of these old birds, and trying to find the characteristics that might have influenced whether a bird actually successfully continued to breed or not, whether it's linked to the duration in rehab, the health conditions, all these things. So because we were still digging for data for so long, unfortunately, these analyses have actually not started as we had promised. We are now getting a postdoc who will hopefully run all these analyses. But we also have a second data set that we are using, which is all the post-treasure oil data from SANCOP. And this is just an overview of the oil spills that SANCOP has responded to since 2000 that are known oil spills, so known events. Some of them are called mystery spill because we don't know what vessel caused it, but we know that there was a spill and we treated birds. And we went through all our admission and cards, medical cards, and we have data now on over 1,000 African penguins and 400 other seabirds that were oiled in those years from these spills. Unfortunately, we also get quite a lot of chronic oiling birds in, so birds where there's no known spills, where it might be just boats cleaning their bilges or some wrecks breaking up in winter storms. And we've included those birds, but we are treating them differently because there's some differences in treatment and what we expect. But that adds another 3,000 African penguins and about another 400 other seabirds to this data set. The other seabirds are mostly Cape gannets. They make up the biggest number. The other species that we can potentially look at from the numbers is Cape cormorants. All other species are just too few birds to actually do any statistical analysis on. So this is what we want to look at for these oil spills. We wanted to look at whether the closeness to the proximity of the spill to the breeding colony affect the species and the amount of birds, as well as the peak of breeding. Obviously, if a spill happens during the breeding season, will it have a bigger effect on the birds? And then look at the health parameters and whether how they will affect the release rate of these birds. And then we want to look at the different parameters and how they are drivers for the rehabilitation outcome. So I have to admit, I'm not a vet, so all these blood values and everything don't tell me much, but that's why I have Nola and Ralph on the team who look at all these things. So they have been looking at all these health parameters and trying to link them with release outcomes. So this is just some preliminary results for the birds, for the African penguins that were in known oil spills. And we can obviously see, which is probably obvious to everybody here in the room, that obviously if a bird has a higher body mass on admission, it has a higher chance of release. That was true for both immature and adults. We also see the plasma total, which I think I was told is kind of a condition index, that if it's basically bird better condition, there's a higher chance of release. We've done some more analysis on the day of admission, basically since the day of the spill. And we can see that obviously the longer birds are out there without being rescued, their body condition decreases over time. So it is important to get these birds as quickly as possible. The packed cell volume, I think, is an indication of hydration. So the longer the birds are out there exposed to the oil, the more dehydrated they get. So, I mean, what all of you are doing is, and know this is the faster you can respond to a spill, the better, to get the birds in better conditions. But this is where we want to look for at the chronic oiling birds, because the problem with chronic oiling birds, in our opinion, is that often they don't get rescued as swiftly because there's not an organized and coordinated rescue. If a boat goes down, if a ship goes down, we will be informed, there will be a rescue, whereas if it's chronic oiling, these birds might be out for quite a long time. So we're expecting that those birds are actually being admitted in much worse condition, and thus will have more problem during rehabilitation. Luckily, we can see so far that the rehabilitation process, the work that we put in trying to rehabilitate these birds, does actually make up for a lot of it. So we are able to respond to a lot of the issues that birds come in. So that's kind of the good side on it. But if body condition is the key to their success and the success of rehabilitation, then we think we actually have a problem, because as most of you know, the African penguin is listed as endangered. It's declining dramatically. We currently have about 2% of the historic population left in the wild. Every year for the last 4 or 5 years, we have the historic lowest number of breeding pairs counted in the wild. And recent statistics have shown that we are losing these birds at a rate of about 10% per year in some of the regions, and that's obviously not sustainable. So these birds are already struggling even without an oil spill. And the most important reasons for the current decline of the African penguin is definitely the lack of sufficient food around the main breeding colonies. We see an overall declining in sardine stocks. And the fish that is there is actually of very low quality. So even the fishermen are complaining that the fish is not worth anything. So penguins and other seabirds that are admitted to Senkop are already emaciated due to lack of food. So if we now add an oil spill to that, we deal with birds that are even more compromised, and we basically start at already very, very bad starting point. We also have seen more disease outbreaks. We had an avian influenza outbreak 2 years ago, and we know the disease risk also increases with reduced fitness in the birds. So we are not only dealing with oil, but with kind of accumulative effects. But as I said, we've seen so far that the rehabilitation techniques seem to be able to overcome some of these problems. Birds might stay long in a rehabilitation, but still have a chance of being released. But so far, we've only looked at the African penguin, and we know that the African penguin is highly resilient. It's quite easy to catch because it can't fly away. So flying birds are usually in much worse conditions when we admit them. So that's why we're really keen to look at the Cape Gannets as well, because there we might see much more dramatic effects of the oiling on these health parameters. And there we are not sure whether our rehabilitation technique can actually carry them through, and we would obviously like to see if there is something that we can improve to get more birds through. As I said, it's quite scary. The current population of the African penguin is about the same number than all birds that were affected by the Treasure oil spill. So that's the oiled birds and the birds that were trucked from the Western Cape to Port Elizabeth. So basically, if an oil spill of this size happened now, we could see a large percentage of the world population of African penguins being affected. So in the year 2000, when the Treasure went down, Robben and Dasson Island were the largest and third largest breeding colonies in South Africa. On the right, you see the 2019 census. These colonies now have between 1,000 and 2,000 breeding pairs left, whereas Dasson Island had 17,000 breeding pairs just 20 years ago. Our currently largest colonies are Bird and St. Croix Island in the Eastern Cape. They have also seen a decline, especially St. Croix, and unfortunately it continues to decline. So yeah, currently our largest colonies are kind of at a size that, so what was Dasson was 17,000 breeding pairs in 2000. Our largest colony is currently 3,600 breeding pairs. So we have a huge issue, and obviously the risk of any spill is now bigger for kind of the overall population to have a population effect. And what is very worrisome is that we have the new developments with, for example, ship-to-ship bunkering operations very close to these two main colonies that we have left in Port Elizabeth. So here you see number one here in this graph is St. Croix Island, so the world's largest African penguin colony, which is literally a stone's throw away from where the bunkering is taking place. The number two indicates Bird Island, which is also the world's largest Cape Gannet colony. And then luckily for SANCOP, we have now a center here where the number three is, so that we are on site and can respond quickly to any spills in this area. But this bay is also a huge industrial development. It has a huge industrial harbor. So we are just waiting basically for a big disaster. But even along the rest of South African coast, obviously the increase in ship traffic, economic development, everything is pushing for more and more ships. So the risk of another oil spill is definitely there. And just in Algoa Bay, the bunkering started in 2016. And since then, we've already seen two official spills. I call them officials. Those are the ones that we were informed about and that we were able to rescue birds. So we had over 200, 250 birds already oiled due to this ship-to-ship bunkering. But currently, we are seeing a lot of oiled gannets on Bird Island from spills that were not officially reported, which just seems, we were told, well, that's just normal during the ship-to-ship bunkering operations, that some oil will be leaking. So we do have an ongoing problem there in this bay, and not only there. So we're hoping with the results of this study that we will learn a little bit more to how to improve, how to respond, and how to rescue these birds to actually successfully release them back into the wild. And yeah, on this little grim note of not seeing the African penguin much longer, but this at least is a group of released birds. These are rehabilitated birds from SANCOP that are released here on a beach in Simonstown, taken out to the ocean. So hopefully there's a silver line on the horizon for the African penguin. And yeah, thank you again for OWCN for funding this study, and we're really looking forward to getting some meaningful results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation and great work. With that, I know we have a few questions in the Q&A. We're gonna stay just a tiny bit longer. For everyone who needs to leave, please do, and thank you so much for coming today. And Kira, I'll turn it over to you for a few minutes. And again, for those who have to leave, thank you for joining us, and we'll stay just a few extra minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks to our speakers, and we did have a few questions roll in, so I'll start with the first one. This is for Dr. Doerr. Did you use any protection for keel lesions?
Well, one of the points of the study was to see what happens without the keel cushions. So the basic premise of the study was that they were not getting any keel cushions. Birds that had obvious keel lesions, though, left the study and had their needs attended to with keel cushions put on after they were taken out of the study.
Okay, great. Thank you. The second question for Dr. Doerr again is, would wounds heal faster in salt water?
You know, I've been hearing the last 20 years, like, salt water cures all. And like, I don't think so. So once these tendons are exposed, once the joint's exposed, once there's dead tissue on your bone, my opinion is that stuff needs treatment, and just releasing it before it explodes, which I think used to be the thing that we did, I don't think it's a good idea. We've seen a fair number of band returns from even oiled animals where they were released with a body part that looked like it was becoming swollen, and then restranding with much worse problems. So I'm not a believer in releasing animals with medical problems.
Okay, thank you. So another question for Dr. Doerr. What were some of the treatments that were utilized for birds that had lesions that required treatment? And a second part to this question is, were the treatments standardized?
No, it's more of an art form. I tend to refer You know, our treatment of lesions has been evolving over time. We've been trying various things for many years. We have a very small number of staff that are adept at making judgment calls on how to treat these things. Consequently, it would be very difficult for us to deal with more than, say, 30 of these really severely injured animals at a time, because it's a real drain on the most senior of staff's decision-making capabilities. It's not really something that we're ready to teach anyone, frankly. It's like that. So we are hoping to do some studies on it in the future, and we'll see how that goes and share as we know things. But it's very, you know, just like sharing a new keel cushion design. There's so many little pitfalls associated with every little thing that it can be kind of challenging to share information sometimes with people without like a full year of working with it to get trained.
Yeah, so sort of related to this question, the other one that came in is, have you changed how you treat lesions as a result of this study?
A little bit. We're better at spotting keel lesions when they're early. I think that we were trying to put off intervening with this cohort of birds, so we did wait on many types of lesions before intervening. I think that we learned a big chunk of the keel lesions, like what severity of a keel lesion needs to go to surgery versus what is going to slough off on its own and be fine, is something that we're much better at judging now. So only I think about a third of the keel lesions that were spotted ended up needing surgery. So I think we're better at waiting.
That's always a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so one last question for Dr. Dorr. Is there any evidence that the bacterial and fungal infections are causative to the skin lesions rather than a result of the infection?
I don't think so. When you have an intact skin barrier, generally there's not a whole lot of access for bacterial invasion. That's the purpose of your skin and your nails and intact tissues. When you have dead tissue over a tendon, or that it's adhered to a tendon or adhered to bone, that's a bacterial pathway right in. So I really don't think so. I mean, it's always possible, but you know,
Right.
Without a wound, you don't generally get an infection randomly too much.
And then a second part to this question, were you able to determine if there was a compromise to immune systems of birds with lesions?
One thing I didn't talk about is that a huge chunk of the birds that we get, especially those Western grebes, are completely emaciated, feathered skeletons when they come in, and they don't have any spare energy for anything. So immune system is definitely compromised. And one thing that we have noticed subjectively, again, is that the birds that have an appetite, start putting on weight, definitely do better. The ones that remain in an emaciated state don't heal wounds well. I don't think they have the energetic resources to repair tissue and respond to infection. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dorr. So now we're going to move over to Dr. Ludinia. Here's a comment and question. It says, great talk and congrats for the hard work on deciphering old data. I assume there is an effort to fingerprint the oil content of spills in South Africa. If so, is there any success in holding accountable those responsible for the spill?
Yes, so we do always take samples, and we have been able in the most recent spills to identify the polluter, and we have the system here, the polluter pays. So we have been able to basically track down the polluter and also get refunded for the work that we've done. I think in the first ship-to-ship bunkering spill in 2016, there was quite a debate because the ship was denying that it was from their oil activities, but it was a fingerprinting that was actually we were able to prove what vessel it was. So yes, that works.
Okay, great, thank you. And second question for you. How is body condition quantified for the penguins, and is it corrected for size?
Yes, so we usually apply kind of a head measurement to body weight. So we've had several studies that looked at that so that we can relate. We obviously get very big females and very small males, so you can't just use the weight. So we do correct for head measurements. In the treasure oil spill data set, that's not possible because we don't have these measurements, but the graphs that I show with the body measurements, those were actually birds where those measurements were taken because that's the post treasure oil spill data set. So there we have the measurements on bill lengths and head lengths and those things that we can use.
So those were baseline data? Or do you have baseline data of non-injured penguins?
Yeah, so for the chicks, for example, we have a study from a year that we kind of was kind of an average good breeding year for Robben Island, where somebody developed a body condition index, and then it was done by a PhD student for adults as well from different data sets of birds in the wild, where we can measure body condition, body size to weight. I think the on this data set here we might have also used. I'm not quite sure if there was other measures taken on admission, whether the body condition was assessed in a different way still.
Okay, thank you. I know we're going over, so there are a few more questions. Deneen, do we want to keep going, or what do you want to do?
How many questions do you have, Kira?
It looks like there might be 4 more questions. 3 questions.
Are we able to, I'd like to try to close in the next couple minutes. Are we able to do 2 of those questions and maybe answer the others in the chat?
Sure. Looks like Mike is answering one of them. So,
Perfect.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Dr. Ludinia, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in rehabilitating penguins?
So luckily, they're actually relatively easy to rehabilitate. So we have, with our penguins, we have a relatively good release rate. Our biggest challenge at the moment is actually knowing that we're releasing those birds into an environment that doesn't support them. So that is the big problem, that we get these birds back to speeds and we get them out, and then we know that we will see them again emaciated a year later or less. So that's why we've kind of spread out a little bit from purely doing rehabilitation to doing a lot of advocacy work for improvement in our fisheries management, for example, working with the colonies to actually improve the habitat for these birds in the wild.
Okay, great, thanks. And then a second question for you as well. Is reproductive success for oiled, rehabbed, released penguins similar to unoiled penguins?
Yeah, so the initial studies that were done with the initial data set shows that breeding success was reduced in previously oiled birds from the treasure oil spill. They started to breed, so a lot of them were seeing breeding, but they weren't very successful in raising their chicks. And I think, strangely enough, a lot of them lost their chick at a relatively late age, and we actually don't know yet what the reason is. So now that we have a longer data set, because we now have more breeding information for these birds for more years until basically last year, we are hoping to get a better handle on these differences between oiled and non-oiled birds on their breeding success.
Okay, one final question for Dr. Ludinia. Are there efforts to establish new breeding colonies for African penguins?
Yes, there are actually. So the problem is that the fish stocks have kind of moved from the west coast, where Robben and Dasson Island are located, further around the coast south and eastwards. And there is a project that is run by BirdLife South Africa to try to establish a new colony at De Hoop, which is kind of on the southern tip of Africa. And we are partnering with BirdLife on this project, and the idea is to actually release some of our hand-reared chicks at the location to try to get them to actually return to there. And there's been some tracking and fishing studies that actually show that the site looks very promising. So we hope that we can establish a new breeding site there, which would be closer to the food that is still available.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Doer and Dr. Ladenia, for your excellent presentations and answering our questions. Back over to you, Deneen.
Okay, thank you all, and thank you for the great questions. Thanks again to everybody for staying on just a few extra minutes, and an extra special thank you to our speakers today. You took time out of your busy schedules and your evening to speak to our network today. So we greatly appreciate, and our OWCN management team speakers as well. So thank you all for your time. Thank you all for joining us today. And we wish you a happy and safe holiday season. And we'll be back with more events after the new year. So thanks again.